and the root of the way we might feel and think is not just this individual inspiration. There's a whole structure around you encouraging you to think and act a certain way to maintain the power structure.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of I Have Something to Say, where subject matter experts are unafraid and unapologetic about sharing their perspectives regarding issues that impact our lives. They speak up because basically they give a shit. So if you're tired of canned answers and want to finally hear real people cut through the BS and talk about real issues, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Sami Jimen Marrero from Urbenter, and behind our mixer is our producer, Chris Majoka from UdoU. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to introduce you to a new friend. I was at a summit a couple of weeks ago in Miami, and I saw Dr. Maribel Morey, who's here with us today. Hi, Dr. Morey. Maribel, how are you?
Bien, bien, Sami, ¿cómo estás?
Super, super. And when I heard her speak on her panel, which was before, I had a chance to participate, my jaw just dropped. I'm like, oh my goodness, I need to meet this woman. And since we've had a chance to talk there and then separately through a Zoom call, and I just want to quickly introduce you, Maribel. You're a historian of U.S. philanthropy, social sciences, and racial equity. You're the founding executive director of the Miami Institute for Social Sciences, which is a nonprofit that centers your work in global majority scholars. And I'm going to ask you to, dig a little deeper into what that means. But it's in the space of social sciences. You're creating this unique platform and space to improve the integrity and rigor of these fields and to build more inclusive national and international political economies. And I also want to talk a little bit about your debut book, which was during the pandemic, White Philanthropy, Carnegie Corporation's An American Dilemma and the Making of White World Order, which I know is, an outcome of your life's work up until now, and there's much more to come. And I'm excited to now have a front row seat to see, the outcome of your research and your work. And so, thank you for joining me in this conversation. And what's your why? What's your big why? How did you land into social sciences? Why are you so passionate about the history, right? And the root of inequities, and why are you so focused now on this idea of a global majority, and not the idea, the reality, right, of a global majority, and create this institute to really focus on doing this work?
Thank you, Sami. First, I want to say I loved meeting you two. We had a major connection. We were at the Hispanic Leadership Summit, and it was one of the first times that I present in a Latino environment. And how long does that take until like you're 40 or so it was really meaningful to me, especially being in Miami, where I was born and raised, and building the Miami Institute now. And there was so much. What I loved too, I don't know if you loved it too, was like the pride and the intention to work together across. And we were talking about that too. Like, we're all very different across Latinidad. And so coming together, and what does that mean to be like a strong cohort supporting each other? Which, as we know, within a family, even, that's not easy because we all see things very differently. So within a community, it's even harder, but a real intention to do it. So that was a real special place to meet. To your questions, the why. So I don't usually say this, but when I was an undergraduate, and I would report in the paper on different talks that were happening on campus, and I would play this little game on myself, changing people's gender, hair color, ethnicity, while listening to them talk and knowing full well how I had been raised in general culture society that was a white supremacist, misogynistic, class-based one, that depending on how I would change, their physical attributes, I would take in their words differently.
Mm.
And that could influence. I was, just as an undergrad, like really aware that would change the way I would report on them, or even how I would describe their wordings. So that early on was an indicator that even that the content of your ideas might not be as significant to the audience as your physical appearance or your social context, like your class, your networks, what university you worked for, what company you worked for. And then as I progressed to in the academy from undergrad to law student to graduate student, PhD, and then faculty member, um, through this process, I realized, okay, no matter how brilliant my ideas might be, like I was very enamored by Simone de Beauvoir, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I thought she was like brilliant. If a man had the same ideas and translated those ideas into his own networks, he might be cited way more and celebrated way more. And I saw that in Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish economist, who really was inspired by her analogy between race and sex in a major book she wrote, The Second Sex, translated it into his sorry, she was inspired by him. Sorry about that. She was inspired by his work, but ultimately people cited him more on the race sex analogy because he was a safer citation to make. So Ruth
Mm.
Bader Ginsburg, the U.S. Supreme Court, read Simone de Beauvoir, but ultimately cited Myrdal more, knowing her audience. So how
Hmm.
one like how do ideas work depending on the vehicle that's transporting them, the body, the person, and their own
Hmm.
networks. Also, if they're based in the US and UK and publish in English and are in elite circles. So I got really interested in that space of the politics, the power structures of how ideas are created and which ones and why ultimately win in the marketplace of ideas. And
Hmm.
many of us out there are trained or assumed to think that it's like a meritocracy, but much like the um, economic structure of this country, it's not just the smartest wins, the smartest makes most money. There's a whole structure around and why and how certain people accumulate wealth. If you look across the board, right, why are so many rich people white Anglo Americans, right?
Right.
And a lot of other BIPOC groups not on the same level. It's not because there's an innate intelligence biologically within certain groups, it's because there's a social structure um, encouraging certain groups and helping certain groups make more money and accumulate wealth across generations, whether from like bank loans to inheritance laws, and then discouraging other groups from maintaining wealth. So I got really interested in how that marketplace plays out in the world of ideas, why certain ones become dominant depending on who's promoting it and why. And so that's connected to my research because
Hmm.
I studied those networks of power in spaces I wouldn't be invited to, necessarily, but I get to be a fly in the wall by accessing the archives. So we can talk about archives more and which ones are open to people to research. And that impacted too, like ultimately, what role am I going to play in the academy? So in the summit as well, we talked about assimilation versus pushing back at the power structure. Uh,
Yes.
was I going to stay quiet and just, try to get what I could within the structure or disrupt it, try to disrupt it so it's more equitable?
Yeah.
So that's the vision for the Miami Institute, which is to amplify the work of other scholars based around the world beyond the US and the UK and global majority scholars, so BIPOC, across the world. And to me, it's we can't just amplify Latinidad without amplifying each other in the global majority, because the reason why certain groups are dominant and not dominant is based on a long history of white Anglo-American supremacy at the expense of the rest of us.
Right.
At the core is anti-black discrimination. So we all have to come together as global majority to amplify all of us because we're those structures affecting all of us.
Yes. And so, and the thing is that all of this research or messaging also informs how we just behave and
Mhm.
operate, right? And how we uh build things together. The whole piece about philanthropy, for example, that's kind of like your wheelhouse too, right? On how it's a construct. Can you dive into your interest or your dissecting, right? The whole aspect of philanthropy here in the US and how um, it makes you go, right? It's like, what
Yeah.
are we doing here?
Yeah. So I think that one thing I would say is that for a lot of us who, uh, let me go backtrack. I didn't know what philanthropy was.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up in Miami, Cuban kid from Miami, the world to me was divided between two things: communism, right? Which is I was raised to say like anything bad was communist. That was the way you
Mm-hmm.
were, right? And in my milieu. And then on the other end was the US. We had a strand of anti-US imperialism in our upbringing, which encouraged Cuban nationalism. But ultimately, what kind of economic structure was permissible was one that was profit maximizing. So
Mm-hmm.
when I assume you're either communist, which is everyone equal, or a system that takes advantage of the worker at any rate, like there's nothing that's
Off limits. Yeah,
off limits.
nothing's off limits. Yes,
Nothing is
nothing's off the table.
nothing
Yeah.
is off, right? So you allow, like it's just part of the system. And so I come across when I'm reading, say I was reading Simone de Beauvoir, and then I got interested. I'm like, who is this Swede that she was inspired by? Because like I think she's amazing. So why would she really rely on this white Swede? Plus, he's writing on race. Like, who told this white Swede that he could write on race in the U.S.? So the more I read into it, I saw, oh, he was financed by this group of people, Carnegie Corporation, and that wasn't intuitive to me. I thought, who would be invested in disrupting the status quo about race in the U.S. With this much money?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And
Because
and
it sounds counter intuitive or counter interest, right? It doesn't.
these
Yeah.
people are not Che Guevara, okay? This is not Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, like training and taking over. They're very, very comfortable in the status quo. They go to elite institutions, they go to jobs, they have their houses and their retirement, and they're not looking for any revolutionary change. So I
Mm-hmm.
got fascinated by the sector in many ways. I'm like, what is philanthropy? How and why is it coming from these elite circles? And when they say they want change, what change are they looking for? Because it's nothing revolutionary. It's not revolutionary, but it's something. So what is that?
Right.
So I'm very intrigued by theories of change,
Mm-hmm.
and what people see as the change they want and why. And
Mm-hmm.
people don't always want it for the same thing. So in my book, I explain how what this organization was looking for was to help advise public policymakers. And again, that's something that runs through the present, looking to impact policy change. Well, that's not necessarily radical change at all. If you're
Mm-hmm.
thinking that the people who are policymakers are actually part of that same power structure, same networks of people who go to the same schools, the
Mm-hmm.
same clubs, and they were actually invested in international order. And these are pretty subtle words that people would probably agree with today: international peace, international order. For them, like many today, it assumed white Anglo-American leadership
Mm-hmm.
or domination, whichever way you want to see it. So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of linking up people across the Atlantic, dealing with a similar problem that they perceived, which was managing white-black relations, which they meant white domination and black subordination, and using research in the social sciences as a tool to help policymakers navigate new and complex dynamics between these two groups. Because to them, avoiding a second world war, this is after World War One, required international peace, and a big threat was a race war. Um,
Mm-hmm.
lines. So, how do you help white policymakers with knowledge inform their policymaking? And so that was the inspiration behind this book. And if you actually read the book, An American Dilemma, the book that Myrdal wrote in 1944, that's cited so much, he writes, I'm helping readers understand how all these steps that they can take to assimilate Black Americans in different parts of US life will help the US become one of the most powerful white nations in the world. So it was
Wow.
so it's to encourage the further strengthening of whiteness,
Right.
and of the white Anglo-American world order. And we still
Right.
see this, like how many people still assume that to have proper leadership in this world, it has to be led and dominated instead of collaborative leadership. That's the most radical thing. Can we
Yeah.
ever assume? Can we ever hope for a world or even a country in the U.S. that's led by collaboration and not domination.
Right. And that's the big, the big question mark, la pregunta de los 24,000 chavitos, como dicen, right? As they say, the $64,000 question. And it's not easy. Do you see that when you left like, how do you say, systemic academia, or when you parted ways and created the Miami Institute, do you see uh, people wanting to engage and connect in this new way of thinking, and really, uh, how do you say, how have you gone through that process of establishing your network, right? Because this is not easy. So I can only assume it's not just local, that you've now reached out to people at a international level to really find your tribe, to try to create these spaces where a real shift can happen in the way we navigate everything we do, from the economy to philanthropy, even, right, through how do you say, delivering basic human needs to people, and mitigating, right, disparities and the inequities that people are experiencing. So what does that look like in your day to day?
Yeah. First, it's a space for a discussion, right? So the question is like how to get everyone at the table. Like in an honest way, how do you get the global majority scholars who are based in different parts of the world? So if you're in, vamos a decir, Johannesburg, South Africa, it's
Hmm.
harder for your work as a scholar, let's say you're an anthropologist, to really be amplified to the people who dominate the field in the US and UK and to impact it. So this is a space of interaction, and also for us to have our own conversations, to learn about that scholar in Johannesburg and say, oh, I'm an anthropologist in Quito, and they're asking similar questions than I am about this field. And they also have worries about how, their community or our communities are being portrayed in this field. And I'm going to say it out loud. I'm not okay with that. And also,
Hmm.
we're asking different questions. Um, and again, that goes back to the key thing, like collaborative leadership. So we have to have collaboration in the knowledge production in order, which influences action, in order to have collaborative actions. Because if you respect each other's intellect, that's key, right? That's why people
Hmm.
are scared in many ways of shared leadership, because we don't respect the potential and stability of each other's intellects.
Hmm.
Respect each other's intellects, and a starting point is among knowledge producers to respect that, which is not the case right now. The case right now is a
Right.
space domination. So we try to
Exactly.
disrupt it to be collaborative. It's a super important and foundational point to ultimately lead to collaborative leadership, whether it's at the office, right, in your own office, and you respect the person across the table from you as a leader, as an intellect, a strong leader and intellect, to government at the different levels, including from the local to the global. So we have really big ambitions, but the networks you're asking about to cultivate, these are networks that we have been heavily, for me, centered in the U.S. Because that's where I was, my training. So our board members are heavily based in the US and UK. Uh,
Okay.
our global majority members in the academy, largely based in the academy. And then we also have a newer board member who's based in Zambia. So over time, we're going to, through our natural networks, and we build them through trust. So how we
Hmm.
do it is like one person at a time saying, hey, this is a safe space. And it is a space that's actually trying to be here for a very long time, and has gravitas, like it has profundidad. So that's how we do it. We build through trust and thoughtful discussions. And we're working now on a global index, which is our big project, to imagine a big Rolodex. People want to diversify their knowledge intake. They don't know who's an anthropologist or economist, they are sociologists anywhere in the world. Well, this will be a database where you can find information about different people across the world producing knowledge across these fields that could help diversify syllabi. So, our kids go to university. It's not okay that if they're majoring in economics, they don't know about any Latinos who've produced knowledge in economics or political science or another field. So what we're paying money for them to go to school, and to learn that we are irrelevant as knowledge producers, which sets them up to start their job in a space that doesn't respect them as knowledge producers, as
Right.
intellect, right? So we
Yeah.
need to disrupt how knowledge is being shared and its total erasure of knowledge produced by the global majority because we all pay the consequences. So that's the vision for it. And then philanthropy and knowledge production, it's one and the same. Like if you're talking about these elite foundational uh, foundations in the US, they're comfortable in the status quo. So they will keep funding the same knowledge producers in elite universities over and over again. So we at the Miami Institute are dreaming, and if you're watching and you're wanting to support a space that's amplifying the work of global majority scholars and always stretching itself to find more and more knowledge producers amongst the global majority, that's something to fund. And we're working from a mutual aid model, and the dream is for all of us, Latinos, Black Americans, Black across the diaspora, Asians, to come and fund each other in this communal space that we're building.
That is awesome. And I got to tell you, that's how we do the work here locally. We're based in Central Florida, not too far, from Miami, where you're based out of. And this is why I was so excited to meet you, because we're very much about working in collaborative spaces, from an entrepreneurial aspect, right, with other business owners, so we can get the bigger work
Mhm.
and the higher impact work too, but also from a nonprofit standpoint, right? I launched a nonprofit 5 years ago, and it hasn't been easy. Let me tell you, but poco a poco, right? Our accomplices, right? Not allies, accomplices. Our list of accomplices grow, and so we're able to further the work. But like you said, it takes a little bit of time because it's organic, it's
Yeah,
natural, and it's for the right reasons, right? And so you want people that are going to step in and support this work, to be in it because they finally get it, right? Or they are interested in doing it in a way that's collaborative, not in a competitive manner, right? And also taking into account other perspectives that are not Eurocentric. That's the other thing too, right? And you have to be comfortable with that, and not everybody is. So
what do you think
it's
about
a
that? I mean, like I've always I circle around that because why would people feel uncomfortable? I'm throwing the question back at you, and I kind of it's a rhetorical question on some level, but it wouldn't we all benefit from a world where we are actually listening to each other, respecting each other before assuming anything otherwise? So what's a standing to say no? I don't. I want to keep it Eurocentric. What do you
Mhm.
think?
Oh no, I mean, I think that we miss out on so many things because a lot of innovation, a lot of new ideas completely get lost. It's like I heard someone say a couple of years ago, it says, the cure for diabetes is probably out there, right? But it's in the pipeline, right, of talent, but it's untapped because of the barriers, right? Right? Maybe it's a person that doesn't look white American, and just doesn't have the access, but the brilliance is there. It's just that it's so difficult sometimes to find the space where it can flourish, where it can be nurtured, where in a culturally competent manner, right, and with relevancy. And so that's part of it too. But that's the situation we're in, right? It's almost like you feel like you're stuck, and you feel you have to navigate with the status quo, within the status quo, and figure out, okay, how can I push, right, and move that needle, towards equity in this system that clearly wasn't designed for equity, right? While we say, screw it, I'm going to focus and build this new thing over here that's not quite that, right? Because that doesn't work. And so it's a struggle to be able to do both, to be able to do this work that you're doing, that we're trying to do here, in both of these spaces. Y es una locura,
No,
sometimes it's so frustrating, and you're like, you know what, let me just live my life. but we can't look away. That's the problem, right?
Yeah,
Because because it can't be through this, and you called it, like, now I see it, right? Is this it's designed to assimilate, right? The other communities to walk lock in step with this Eurocentric way of doing things. And why should it, if now we're becoming the global majority?
yeah,
We saw the census numbers, right, during the presentation at the Latino Leadership Summit. So this is happening. And so, anyway, I know that, and it's all about the messaging, and it comes down to even the words we use. And it's something that we talked about too. And that's why the scholarly work is so important, because it'll inform, the way we communicate, we engage with, even the way we collaborate with each other, so we're more aware and we can point it out, right? It's like, it wasn't until, like, maybe 6 7 years ago that I understood what a microaggression was, for example, right? And I'm like, pero como? Okay, wow. So when, oh yeah, or why the question, where are you from? Right? Oh, where are you from? It's not, it's designed to create a barrier, right? To say, you're not us, you're not from here, this is
right.
not your, and so, but it's so, how do you say, important to understand the root, right, of that language use too.
Yeah,
And
and the root of how what the way we might feel and think is not just this individual inspiration. There's a whole structure around you encouraging you to think and act a certain way to maintain the power structure. I'll explain that as an example. Let's say you're an immigrant, right? Let's say we're Cuban from Miami. There's and there's a long history. Scholars long have documented it. One of the first things that immigrants learn pretty quickly is that to become American, to be accepted as American by the dominant group, you try to access that whiteness as fast as you can, and you incorporate a lot of anti Black discrimination. So you
mm,
start hating on Black people and distancing yourself from Blackness. So it's like access whiteness, make it the dominant, the most wonderful thing in the world, and forgive it for all of its troubles, and demonize Blackness. Now, I would suggest that there's every immigrant here, assuming we want to maintain pride in our roots, to lean on the African American experience. One, because in that literature and those experiences, there's been less of this option of assimilation. Some people could pass, but the question was, how do I maintain my dignity in a space that others me permanently?
wow.
So how do I maintain my Latinidad? The moment that I went, when I started realizing that my identity as a Latina was associated with underperformance in schools, or less intelligent, that I should be more sensual, and that I was a sexy student instead of like a rigorous, serious person who wanted to make an impact and be a scholar. And that would, and knowing that would follow me throughout my life, even as an adult, right? Because if I was here as a white Anglo American man with tweed, with the same content coming out of me, it would be very different. So, how do we understand that experience? And leaning and understanding the African American experience is enriches the soul and helps us understand this very structure that has centuries of existence in this country.
Wow. Wow. And also, it informs the when you don't lean into that, right? It informs also even messaging within our own communities too. Because I was sharing with you this campaign that we're actually launching. We just launched this week, right? And you only call us in September because Hispanic Heritage Month is coming up, and we know what happens, right? When all of a sudden we're visible, and but that's part of the problem, because a lot of Latinos lean into the whiteness if they can, right? Then it's I call it Latino incognito, right? Then they blend in, and then all of a sudden, yes, we're doing it to ourselves. We're becoming invisible because we're not owning that Latinidad, right? And I say we meaning the whole Latinx, Latine, Hispanic, Latino, Latina, however you want to call it, because that's I mentioned it in the other podcast. That's by design too, right? All of these labels. And so it was interesting because we were having this conversation about the use uh, of certain terms in the campaign that we're producing around Hispanic heritage, and you mentioned that might not resonate, for example, with Latinos in Miami. And then I was talking to a friend over the weekend. She's from LA, ¿verdad? Mexicana from LA. And Laura tells me, oh, maybe we need to switch it up. I said, well, I'm trying to make it as evergreen as possible, but it's important to pause for a minute and listen to each other too, right? Because if we want to be effective, it warrants, right? Or it begs actually to share what you're working on with trusted, right? Trust again is at the core, people in your circle, so they can give you an opinion, an honest opinion, so we can calibrate and really be more effective in the work we do, y no cogerlo personal, and not get that, take it personally, right?
And
And
that's
so
right, because you are
yeah.
talking to each other, right? Like you're decentering the main audience. So like if you were like, I don't care what Laura says or Maribel, I have my campaign. The people who are funding my campaign are in New York and they only speak English and they think of us, in these terms. You could easily do that because the power structure might allow you to do it, unless you're shifting it and there are different funders, or you're pushing back a bit on the messaging.
Yeah, I know. Well, this one I'm funding. So that's why I listen, because I love collaborative programs. And so anyway, so we're gonna make some adjustments. I'm thinking even of doing, the captions in Spanish, so that way we porque es todo en inglés, pero if we put the captions, it'll broaden the audience, So thank you. I really thank you for building new knowledge constantly that can really help us, right? Because it's like the foundational factors, right, in anything we do moving forward as a society. And so it was just so it's been so great to meet you, Maribel. And I know this is the second or third of many more conversations. And my tribe is your tribe. We're all part of the same tribe. And so I definitely want to make sure that we introduce each other, to other people that are doing this work, so that way we can really weave, this kind of idea generation into all of the work that we do.
And Sammy, I know that I want to end by decentering myself. I know that you told me, we're in the marketing world. It's helpful to center ourselves, but for real, the reason why I find a lot of meaning in this work too is building upon the work of our ancestors. Okay, across the global majority. And when I was writing White Philanthropy, one of the things that got to my heart is how W.B. Du Bois, a leading scholar, Black scholar in the U.S., was close to these networks of foundations, but he never got the funding he wanted for a project, an encyclopedia that was Pan African encyclopedia, because the funders couldn't see really like the value of it. Versus a white man from Sweden coming in more like this colonial role to give advice to white policymakers on a problem they perceive. So imagine like someone framing it as the problem of Latinos in the U.S., the problem of their very existence, really.
Right.
So I think I'm standing on the work of generations of previous people who have been fighting a similar fight, which is to say the knowledge we produce in our communities is important. It should be supported, and the way we talk about each other should not be about the Latino problem. Who's shaping it that way? Or the problem of Black people. It's actually that this should be a collaborative society. And so, how is the knowledge we're producing helping to shape that? And so, people have died doing that. I mean, in the sense of that's been their life's work. Or the person producing knowledge in Puerto Rico, whose work is not amplified to the same level, but we would all be better for knowing about what they're producing or thinking about. So, as much as yes, we are building the Miami Institute, it's a work with building upon the legacy of many, many people before us.
This is wonderful. Yes. And so we're going to include the link for the Miami Institute in the post, so that way people can go in there, explore. There are a whole bunch of essays. I was looking at the forums. I'm like, oh my goodness, so much yumminess and so much great content, right? Very interesting and thought provoking and radical, like you mentioned, earlier, And so then again, thank you for the courage too, right? Because it's not easy to, talk about these things and to push against, the system that we all live in, and trying to make it better. So I'm really thankful for that, Maribel, and thank you for making time to join us today.
Thank you, Sami, and thank you for the space and for your work.
Nos vemos pronto. I'll see you
Nos vemos
soon.
pronto.
Okay. Okay.
This concludes this episode of I Have Something to Say. We want to thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. We're on Spotify and iTunes as well. There's more to come next week. And remember, if you have something to say, it's time to speak up.